We all know Alberta is resource-rich. Its economy driven by oil and gas. But does that wealth, the energy, the jobs, the revenue, make Alberta the economic engine of Canada?
In recent decades, Alberta has been an engine of Canada's prosperity.
The economic engine.
The economic engine.
The economic engine.
Even today, this is a claim you can find right on the Government of Alberta website. It's also a frequent argument of the separation movement, which believes Alberta oil is the tireless workhorse of Canada's economy. But is this true? And what explains how we can ask an expert and get an answer like this?
So Alberta historically has the highest levels of real GDP growth, highest levels of real GDP per person.
But then ask a couple of other experts and get this.
So if we're just looking at GDP alone, no, it's not the engine.
Alberta doesn't stand out with an unusually strong contribution, at least in recent years.
So let's look at numbers, yay, and how they can be interpreted differently depending on what point you want to make. Starting with the granddaddy of all numbers when you're talking about economic anything. Alberta is home to one of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. According to the government, they're sitting on somewhere north of 150 billion barrels of oil. That potential is tapped every day. But what's it worth? Looking at GDP is how we can start to answer that question.
Think of it as the total amount of income that is generated each year for individuals, for businesses, and so on within the province.
Right, and if oil is key to your claim of being the horsepower of Canada, you're probably pulling in more dollars and cents each year than any other province, right? Except, let's look at the actual ranking. With the lowest GDP nationwide, the territories, followed by the Atlantic provinces, and the prairies making up the middle of the list. But then, a huge leap into the most productive provinces in Canada. British Columbia is number 4, and can you guess who number 3 is? This is actually where you'll find Alberta, short of Quebec at number 2 by about $100 billion, adjusted for inflation, and the number 1 spot, and it's not even close, Ontario, by a big margin. And we can look at these same numbers in a slightly different way as well. If we take all those bars and mash them together into a pie, it's easier to see what share of Canada's GDP each province pulls in. Alberta's piece of the pie, just over 15%. So, one might ask, what kind of engine only produces 15% of the drive? Well, one might answer, that's not really a fair way of looking at it.
When you're looking at aggregate GDP, it can be very misleading because, for example, Ontario has more people being productive.
Yes, what we've looked at so far is incomplete because Alberta's 15% share of GDP might actually be pretty good. Let me explain. If we unmake the pie and switch back to bars for a moment, this is every province and territory's share of Canada's GDP. But compare this performance with their share of the population, because this might give us a different sense of whose production is impressive. Because Ontario literally has more than triple Alberta's population, so we should expect its GDP to be much higher, right? But based on population, we can identify all of the provinces who punch below their weight. That's Ontario by a hair, Quebec, Manitoba, and most of the Atlantic provinces. As in, you would expect them to make more money, considering how many people they have. Then, take a look at Alberta, which overperforms. In this sense, easily the most productive province in the country.
GDP can be impacted by A, being more productive, or B, simply having more people. Alberta punches above its weight on GDP per person.
It isn't by itself the biggest single provincial contributor to the Canadian economy. That belongs to Ontario. But for the size of Alberta's population, 5 million people, it contributes about 15% to the Canadian economy, and that's a bit of an outsized contribution.
And that outsized contribution matters in at least one very important way. Okay, you might be thinking, so Alberta's not the most important province, but considering their size, they pull pretty impressive numbers. Why might that make Alberta the economic engine of Canada?
GDP per capita correlates very, very strongly with average income levels of individuals, average wages, average hourly labor compensation.
Yes, and follow me here. He's saying there's a relationship between what we've been talking about, so Alberta's impressive GDP per capita, and how much Albertans make each year. This stat is important enough for Alberta to want to track it very closely, partly because it's a pretty strong selling feature if you're trying to market your province, but it's also a reminder that people with high salaries pay high taxes, and tax revenue spills over into the rest of the country. You're welcome.
In the last 11 years alone, the net transfer from Albertans to the rest of the country was $240 billion. That's a personal contribution to Canada of $55,000 from each and every Albertan.
A number of politicians, especially from Alberta, have made this argument over the years, and it's based on this graph showing which provinces receive equalization payments from the federal government. The Atlantic provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba. They all receive often billions of dollars a year that Ottawa takes in as tax revenue and then hands out to provinces who can't raise enough taxes to maintain a certain standard of services. So things like healthcare, education, daycares, that sort of thing. Quebec is easily the biggest beneficiary, receiving last year more than $13 billion, which, by the way, is more than what every other province received combined. Alberta, on the other hand, while it does receive health and social transfers, it's gotten nothing in the way of equalization payments, specifically, for the last 60 years.
Ottawa will take our tax dollars and they'll redistribute it in a way to make sure that PEI can deliver the same services as Ontario, BC, or Nunavut. So in that sense, then, Alberta probably pays more in taxes to Ottawa than they get back in services, in part because Alberta's income is higher than it is in the rest of Canada on average.
So from 2007 to 2022, Albertans made a $245 billion net contribution to federal finances. Ontario and British Columbia were the only other net contributors, and Alberta's contribution was 5 times that of either of those provinces.
So if you only look at equalization, it does look unfair, but it's not meant to be that everybody gets the same from equalization. It's meant that equalization sort of shores up those who have less in the way of revenues.
So, is Alberta the economic engine of Canada? Maybe, especially if you consider that federal top-up Quebec got last year, that equalization payment. It was almost 10% of Quebec's total government revenue. For some provinces, the payment's more like 20%.
Albertans do contribute, make an outsized contribution to the Federation, to the rest of Canada.
Now, in the time we have, we can't consider absolutely everything that makes Alberta economically important. But there is more to say about the single most critical feature of Alberta's economy that sets it apart from any other province in both a good way and a bad way. What Alberta does better than anyone else in Canada, without exception, is bring in outside money. Oil and gas together are the #1 Canadian export by a country mile. Alberta is also a hub for petroleum refining, with the overwhelming majority of all exports going to the United States. Tapping into American money is an important driver of Canadian wealth, and the US is an important customer to have, with almost 10 times Canada's population. But this is also where the strength of Alberta's economy becomes more complicated.
We're spending hundreds of billions a year to take care of Canada. We lose in trade deficits.
This graph shows how much of each province and territory's economic output is tied, both directly and indirectly, dependent, really, on the United States. Alberta is in a class of its own. And that makes it much more susceptible to outside forces like price shocks for oil.
Alberta can have exceptionally fast growth and it can have exceptionally large collapses. It lives and dies by non-renewable resources.
And Albertans have viscerally felt this boom-bust cycle in the late 90s.
As world oil prices continue plummeting, Alberta is expecting the worst.
Now oil prices are hovering just over $15 US a barrel, the lowest level in 4 years.
Then, around 15 or so years after that,
companies are cutting back on hiring and investment, and the plummeting price of oil means the government's energy royalties are tumbling too.
and then COVID was a whole other nightmare. Here's the going rate of Canadian crude over the last 20 or so years. At its peak, trading well over $100 a barrel. Those were good times. But during bad times, like when the pandemic destroyed the world's economy, oil worth just a few dollars a barrel. This has meant one very simple thing. If Alberta is the economic engine of Canada, it's an engine that does not always run at peak efficiency.
The boom period that we saw prior to 2015 just hasn't been there. And so Alberta's contributed over those years, the past decade roughly, less than 9% of the total. And Ontario and Quebec combined to account for nearly 2/3. So the larger provinces, of course, tend to contribute most to economic growth, but Alberta doesn't stand out with an unusually strong contribution, at least in recent years.
So how do we answer this question about Alberta's relative importance to the country? Well, look, it's complicated, and there are so many other considerations that we haven't touched on. But Alberta is undeniably important. And during these uncertain economic times, it's still easily one of the biggest cogs in the machine. Boom or bust.